If we read and consume content the way 99% of people do, then we'll never achieve the true freedom and fulfillment we want in our lives. Over my years as a peer-reviewed researcher in the behavioral sciences, as well as through my experience in both academic coaching and entrepreneurship, I've discovered 5 approaches to reading and consuming content that literally grow our brain, and in so doing, give us greater control over our lives than the vast majority of people. And the first and most important approach is to read and consume content we disagree with. And as we'll see, practicing this approach has a direct effect on the actual growth of our brain, as well as on our overall ability to learn and solve problems. You see, the brain works kind of like a muscle does. If we want to make our muscles bigger and stronger, what do? We lift weights. We challenge the muscle. In fact, to make a muscle grow, we have to challenge it so much that the muscle fibers tear. And by tearing and then recovering with the right nutrition, they grow bigger. Our muscles are what are called an anti-fragile system, a system that grows and develops in response to stress. And surprise, surprise, our brain is also an anti-fragile system. In fact, studies have shown that people who hold extreme ideologies or very rigid beliefs, yet do not actively question their beliefs, tend to have underdeveloped regions of their brains associated with critical thinking. But remember, our brains are anti-fragile. They are dynamic. So the good news is that we can always take action to reverse this. So for instance, back in my undergrad college days, I considered myself to be a libertarian for a while. I read books such as For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard, Anarchy, State and Utopia by Robert Nozick, The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, and a whole host of other books on this topic. But because I wanted to be armed with all the counter-arguments to this political philosophy, I made sure I also read books such as The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money by John Maynard Keynes, Capital by Karl Marx, and A Theory of Justice by John Rawls. Have you ever taken this approach to reading? If so, how did it benefit you? Well, although my approach here was good, my motivation was all wrong. You see, my point here isn't to take some political position. I frankly don't care where you stand politically, religiously, or whatever. That's your personal choice. The greater point here is that I made a massive mistake while reading all these books, and it's a mistake you can avoid by taking the second approach to reading we'll discuss. Read to prove yourself wrong. This practice, scientifically speaking, literally gives us greater free will. More specifically, it increases our ability to regulate our emotions, decide how to respond, and form our values thoughtfully. You see, as I read these books that were counter-arguments to my then libertarian position, my motivation for reading them was to make sure I understood those counter-arguments well enough to argue against them when I heard someone taking those positions. In other words, my motivation was to do the mental gymnastics necessary to dismiss all the arguments against libertarianism. And let's be real, you've probably done this at some point too. And the thing is, our brain will grow to some extent this way, but it won't grow to its full potential because we aren't developing mental resilience, which in psychology has been shown to increase what is called our self-regulation. In other words, when our goal in learning new information is simply to reinforce what we already believe and therefore shield ourselves from potentially being wrong, we also therefore prevent ourselves from experiencing the inevitable emotional pain associated with having our views proved wrong. But just remember, just as a muscle can't grow unless the muscle fibers are torn, so too can't our brains develop and grow stronger unless we experience this emotional pain. But that pain is only temporary. Because guess what happens as a result? Well, according to decades of research in social cognitive theory, we develop a greater capacity for self-regulation, which, put simply, is the ability to control how we react to our emotions. In a very real sense, by going through this process, we're developing greater and greater free will. And if you want a step-by-step guide to help you develop this ability, then check out my free life orientation guide in the pinned comment below. You see, whereas my motivation for reading these types of books was self-protection, our motivation instead should be understanding. In other words, it's a mindset of humility. One of the best books I've ever read is The Theory of Communicative Action by the thinker Jürgen Habermas. And one of the central ideas of his theory is that communication between people should have as its goal understanding. In other words, when we communicate with each other, our primary goal shouldn't be convincing, debating, or manipulation. Instead, it should simply be to understand the other person. And of course, isn't this easier said than done? But I believe we should take the same approach to reading and content consumption. For instance, let's say you read the book 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson or On Language by Noam Chomsky. You may or may not agree with many of Peterson's right-leaning social or political views, and you may or may not agree with many of Chomsky's left-leaning social or political views, but here's a challenge for you. Simply read their books for the purpose of understanding their positions, and as you read with no judgment of whether you agree or disagree with them. By the end of each book, simply ask yourself, what were some strong points the author made? What were some weak points? In fact, even try to put yourself in their shoes and their mind, and if you have the courage, imagine you are them and try to actively argue against what you personally believe. At the end of the day, what are you really afraid of? If what you believe really is true and correct, then challenging it and analyzing it shouldn't weaken your belief, it should strengthen it. Which brings us to our third approach for reading and content consumption: resist binary thinking. This practice, as we'll see, develops our creative problem-solving ability and our ability to make connections where most people simply can't. Binary thinking is simply the fallacy that there are only two choices: capitalism versus communism, religious versus secular, positive thinking versus negative thinking, and so on. The fact is, gray areas exist everywhere in life. This isn't to say there's no such thing as objective truth. For sure, there's a concept in logic called the excluded middle, which tells us a statement can either be true or false, but not something in between. However, most of what we read or consume isn't offering us specific true or false statements. It's offering us systems of ideas, which involve potentially thousands of true or false claims. The problem, though, it is highly unlikely any given ideology or system of ideas is 100% correct. The more likely scenario is that some part of it is correct and some part of it is incorrect. And why is this? Because general statements, what in logic are called universal statements, are rarely true. Let's take the simple and even seemingly common sense example of all people want to be happy. Well, if I can find even 1 out of 8 billion people on Earth, or even throughout the entire span of history, who don't or didn't want to be happy, then I can disprove this statement. So when it comes to our own thinking, we have to be extremely careful. Be skeptical of broad claims or broad systems of ideas. When you read anything and are attempting to understand it and evaluate it, ask yourself, is there a third option or way beyond what the writer has presented here? Is there a fourth way, even a fifth way? Once again, to use weight training as an example, because it really is so similar to what we're talking about here, when you lift 20-pound weights for a while, they eventually get easy because your muscles have adapted to the stress. Therefore, if you always simply keep lifting 20-pound weights, your muscles will stop growing. So if you want them to keep growing, you've either got to add more weight or more reps. And thinking beyond binary concepts is one key approach that helps us add more weight and more reps to our brain, so to speak. Specifically, moving past binary thinking has been shown to help us grow our capacity for what is called convergent thinking, or the evaluation of multiple ideas to come up with a solution, and divergent thinking, or the evaluation of multiple solutions or options. Both of these are essential to critical thinking because they are essentially the foundations of creative problem solving. And without creative problem solving, we will always have the same old ideas as everyone else. We'll never be able to get to that next level because we'll never be able to innovate. It's the difference between Steve Jobs and the thousands of mediocre entrepreneurs. It's the difference between Kobe Bryant and the many mediocre athletes. It's the difference between Mozart and K-pop. Sorry, but it's kind of true. Another of my favorite books, The War of Art by Steven Pressfield, emphasizes this, and it's a great book to read to help you develop your creativity. Which brings us to our fifth approach to reading and content consumption: read for action, which ultimately helps us develop real-world skills. Having come from the academic world, I can't tell you how frustrating it is to look back to see so many brilliant people with such great ideas who maybe published a lot of papers and research, but never really got out there in the real world to get their hands dirty. All too often in the academic world, we see ourselves sitting in an armchair, up in an ivory tower, discussing things like morality, justice, economics, and all this stuff. But if we never go out and test our morality, if we never go out and start a business, if we never travel to another country or place and make new friends and try new projects, these brilliant thoughts, they're just thoughts. When I got into the world of sales and entrepreneurship, I quickly realized so many skills I was lacking. Communication skills, financial management skills, and so on. I actually became a little resentful I hadn't learned these skills earlier. Because the truth is, when you combine theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge, the result is the highest form of intelligence you can achieve. But what actions should we take? Well, the first step we can take toward real-world action with the books and content we're consuming is to join or create a mastermind group of some sort. Nowadays, if you have a smartphone and internet access, there are all sorts of digital groups you can join and even do weekly Zoom meetings with to discuss ideas. If you can, meet in person weekly with the agenda of simply discussing ideas you're reading about and potentially even throwing them out there for debate. Back when I was in my undergrad university, I attended 2 groups like this, one on the topic of philosophy and another on the topic of history. Not only did I build great relationships from these groups, but they also helped us all develop and clarify our ideas. From there, a friend of mine and I even went so far as to start up a campus newspaper that competed with the official campus newspaper, and while it ultimately failed, we learned a lot from the experience. And this is an example of how these kinds of groups can lead to new ideas, which ultimately lead to action. When we learn something from experience, something magical happens to the books we read. They seem to change. But it's not the books that are changing, it's us. While running my previous businesses, I had a constant habit of reading personal growth books and business books, and I made it a point to actually reread certain books. As I would go out, take action, and get good or bad results, I would go back to certain books, and specifically because I had the experiences I had, the information I previously read that didn't make a whole lot of sense at the time, finally made a ton of sense. Taking these 5 approaches to reading and content consumption more generally takes a lot of work. It's not automatic, especially in the age of social media algorithms, which are fine-tuned to expose you only to the content you like and agree with. We have to proactively look for content and ideas that challenge our thinking. If you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact, not only on your own life, but also on the lives of countless others, then be sure to watch this next video.